Let me ask you something. Have you ever heard of the Siege of Cartagena de Indias? No. That's exactly the problem. In 1741, a one-eyed, one-armed, one-legged Spanish admiral with 3,000 men defeated the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled up to that point in history. 27,000 British troops. 186 ships. The most powerful naval armada Britain had ever sent across the Atlantic. And they got absolutely destroyed by a crippled Spanish veteran who could barely walk. This isn't some minor skirmish historians argue about. This is one of the most lopsided, humiliating defeats in British military history, and you've probably never heard of it because the British literally tried to erase it from the record. Medals were melted down. Paintings were destroyed. Documents were classified. Admiral Edward Vernon was so confident of victory he had commemorative coins minted before the battle even started, showing himself standing triumphantly over Cartagena. Those coins still exist today. They're a monument to one of the greatest military miscalculations ever made. The man who beat him was Blas de Lezo. Born in 1689 in the Basque Country, he lost his left leg to a cannonball at age 17 during the Battle of Valles-Malaga. At 25, he lost his left eye to shrapnel at the Siege of Toulon. A few years later, a musket ball shattered his right arm, leaving it permanently crippled. By the time he arrived in Cartagena de Indias as commander of the Spanish defense, he was 52 years old, mutilated by 3 decades of warfare, and responsible for defending one of the wealthiest cities in the Spanish Empire with a skeleton garrison against an invasion force 9 times his size. If this story teaches you something new, here's what I need. Hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel. Drop a comment telling me if you've ever heard of Blas de Lezo before today. No fluff. No filler. Just the facts, the tactics, and one of history's most satisfying underdog victories. Let's get into it. The year is 1739. Britain and Spain have just gone to war over something called the War of Jenkins' Ear, which sounds ridiculous until you understand what actually happened. A Spanish Coast Guard captain named Julio Leon Fandino boarded a British merchant ship suspected of smuggling, and during the confrontation, he sliced off the ear of the ship's captain, Robert Jenkins. Jenkins preserved his severed ear in a jar, brought it back to London, and displayed it before Parliament. The British public went insane. Newspapers screamed for revenge. The war hawks in Parliament saw an opportunity. Spain's American colonies were rich beyond measure. Cartagena de Indias was the primary port where silver from Potosi, emeralds from Muzo, and gold from New Granada were loaded onto treasure fleets bound for Seville. If Britain could take Cartagena, they could cripple Spain's economy and potentially seize control of the entire Spanish Main. Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who opposed the war, was overruled. King George II wanted Spain humbled. The Admiralty began assembling the invasion force in Jamaica. Command was split between 2 men who despised each other from the start. Admiral Edward Vernon, 60-year-old naval commander, arrogant, experienced, politically connected. General Thomas Wentworth, army commander, cautious, methodical, resentful of taking orders from a sailor. This divided command would doom the expedition before a single shot was fired, but nobody in London cared about command structure. They cared about results. Vernon's plan was straightforward. Sail to Cartagena with overwhelming force. Bombard the fortifications into rubble. Land troops. Accept the Spanish surrender. Sail home a hero. He projected 6 weeks, maybe 8. The Admiralty gave him everything he asked for. 186 ships, including 15 ships of the line, 28 frigates, and dozens of transport vessels. 27,000 men, including 9,000 British regulars, 4,000 colonial troops from North America, and 14,000 sailors and marines. Lawrence Washington, half-brother of George Washington, served in this expedition. So did Tobias Smollett, who would later write about the disaster in his novel Roderick Random. This was the largest British military operation in the Western Hemisphere until the American Revolution. Vernon was so confident he had medals struck in advance. On one side, his portrait. On the other, him standing over the kneeling Spanish governor of Cartagena, with the inscription, the pride of Spain humbled by Admiral Vernon. Thousands of these medals were produced. They were meant to commemorate his inevitable triumph. Instead, they became evidence of his staggering arrogance. The fleet departed Jamaica on January 9, 1741. It took 2 weeks just to get the massive armada organized and underway. When they arrived off the coast of Cartagena on March 13, the Spanish defenders saw the horizon disappear behind British sails. It must have looked like the end of the world. 186 ships stretching from one end of the bay to the other. Gun ports open. Marines packed onto the decks. Flags snapping in the wind. The British were so confident they didn't even bother with a blockade at first. They just sat there, letting the Spanish see exactly how outmatched they were. Blas de Lezo watched them from the fortress of San Felipe de Barajas, the massive stone citadel overlooking the city. He had known this was coming. Spanish intelligence in Jamaica had reported the buildup for months. He had begged the Viceroy of New Granada, Sebastián de Eslava, for reinforcements. He got nothing. The Spanish Empire was overstretched, fighting wars in Europe, struggling with rebellions in Italy. Cartagena was on its own. Lezo's entire defensive force consisted of 3,000 men. 6 undermanned warships. 50 cannons scattered across 8 separate forts. That was it. No relief force was coming. No last-minute reinforcements. 3,000 men against 27,000. Most commanders would have surrendered. Lezo started preparing his defense. Cartagena's geography was its greatest asset, and Lezo knew every inch of it. The city sat on a peninsula, protected by a series of forts and natural barriers. To reach the city, the British would have to fight their way through a gauntlet of fortifications. First, they'd have to force the entrance to the outer harbor at Boca Chica, a narrow channel guarded by 2 forts, San Luis and San Jose, with a boom chain stretched between them to block enemy ships. Then they'd have to fight through the inner harbor, defended by more forts and the 6 Spanish warships. Then they'd have to breach the walls of the city itself. And finally, towering over everything, the fortress of San Felipe de Barajas, a star-shaped monster built on a hill 150 feet above sea level, with walls 40 feet thick and a network of tunnels allowing defenders to shift position without being seen. Lezo's plan was simple. Make the British pay for every inch. Slow them down. Bleed them. Force them into siege warfare in the Caribbean during the rainy season, when disease killed more men than bullets. He didn't have to win battles. He just had to survive long enough for the British to destroy themselves. Vernon attacked Boca Chica first. On March 15, British warships began bombarding Forts San Luis and San Jose. The Spanish forts fired back, but they were hopelessly outgunned. British ships of the line carried 70, 80 cannons each. The forts had maybe a dozen guns each. The British could afford to trade shots all day. The Spanish couldn't. Lezo ordered the commanders of San Luis and San Jose to hold as long as possible, then retreat before the forts were overrun. Don't waste men in a hopeless defense. Make the British work for it, then fall back. The bombardment lasted 9 days. British guns pounded the forts around the clock. Stone walls crumbled. Spanish cannons were dismounted. On March 24, British troops stormed San Luis. The Spanish garrison fought hand-to-hand in the breaches, then retreated across the water to the mainland. The British raised the Union Jack over the ruins. Vernon sent a dispatch to London announcing the fall of the outer defenses. He predicted Cartagena would fall within days. He was wrong. With Boca Chica secured, Vernon ordered his ships into the inner harbor. That's when the real nightmare began. Lezo had scuttled his 6 warships in the narrow channels leading to the city, creating artificial reefs that blocked the passage of deep-draft warships. British ships trying to navigate the harbor ran aground on submerged masts and wreckage. Spanish gunners in the remaining forts fired red-hot shot into British ships trapped in the shallows. One British ship of the line, HMS Marlborough, ran aground and had to be abandoned. Another, HMS Shrewsbury, took so much damage it had to be towed out of range. The British fleet, which had looked so invincible in open water, was being torn apart in the confined waters of the harbor. Vernon and Wentworth held a council of war on April 5. The Navy couldn't get close enough to bombard the city effectively. That meant the army would have to take Cartagena by land assault. Wentworth proposed a methodical siege, digging approach trenches, bringing up heavy artillery, reducing the Spanish fortifications piece by piece. Vernon refused. That would take months. His men were already falling sick. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery. Every day anchored in the harbor, more sailors and soldiers died. He demanded an immediate assault on the fortress of San Felipe. Wentworth argued it was suicide. San Felipe sat on top of a hill with clear fields of fire in every direction. British troops would have to march uphill under artillery and musket fire with no cover. Vernon overruled him. He was the senior commander. The attack was scheduled for April 9. Lezo watched the British prepare. He pulled every available man into San Felipe. Soldiers, sailors, militia, even armed civilians. He positioned his cannons to sweep the approaches. He dug trenches across the likely attack routes. He placed sharpshooters in the tunnel network with orders to fire on British officers. And then he waited. The British attacked at dawn. Wentworth sent 3 columns totaling 1,500 men up the hill toward the fortress. They advanced in parade ground formation, drums beating, flags flying, like they were marching across a European battlefield. Spanish artillery opened fire at 400 yards. Cannonballs ripped through the British lines. Men fell in clumps. Officers screamed orders. The columns kept advancing, closing ranks over their dead. At 200 yards, Spanish muskets opened fire from the walls. British soldiers started dropping faster. At 100 yards, Spanish defenders rolled barrels filled with gunpowder and scrap metal down the hill into the advancing troops. The explosions shredded entire platoons. The British reached the outer ditch of the fortress and tried to deploy scaling ladders. That's when they discovered the ladders were too short. Nobody had properly scouted the walls. The ladders didn't reach the top. British soldiers stood in the ditch, completely exposed, while Spanish defenders fired straight down into them. It was butchery. Men shot in the head, the chest, the back as they tried to flee. Officers tried to rally their troops for another push. Most of those officers were shot by Spanish marksmen who'd been specifically instructed to target anyone giving orders. After 3 hours, Wentworth ordered a retreat. The British left behind 400 dead and wounded in front of San Felipe. They captured nothing. Vernon was furious. He blamed Wentworth for insufficient aggression. Wentworth blamed Vernon for ordering a suicidal frontal assault. The two commanders stopped speaking to each other. All communication between Army and Navy went through junior officers. Meanwhile, disease was destroying the British expedition faster than Spanish guns. Yellow fever swept through the fleet. Men vomited black bile and died within days. Dysentery left soldiers too weak to stand. Fresh water ran low. Food supplies spoiled in the tropical heat. The hospitals in Jamaica overflowed with sick and dying men. Ship captains reported entire gun crews incapacitated. By mid-April, the British had lost over 3,000 men to disease, more than the entire Spanish garrison. Vernon tried again. On April 16, he ordered another assault on San Felipe, this time at night. 2,000 British troops attacked under cover of darkness, hoping to surprise the Spanish defenders. They didn't. Lezo had sentries posted in the tunnel network who heard the British forming up and alerted the garrison. When the British advanced, Spanish defenders lit massive bonfires on the walls, illuminating the approaches. Cannon and musket fire cut down the attackers before they reached the walls. The British retreated again, leaving another 300 casualties behind. Wentworth refused to order any more frontal assaults. Vernon accused him of cowardice. Their shouting match was overheard by junior officers and spread through both the fleet and the army. Morale collapsed. Soldiers and sailors started openly questioning why they were dying for a city they couldn't take. Desertions began. Men slipped away from the camps at night, stealing boats, trying to sail back to Jamaica. Some were caught and hanged. Most drowned. Nobody cared. Lezo sent out raiding parties at night. Small groups of Spanish soldiers and militia would infiltrate the British siege lines, kill sentries, burn supplies, and disappear before the British could respond. One raid destroyed a British powder magazine, killing 30 men and wounding 50 more. Another ambushed a British patrol, killed the officers, and melted back into the jungle. The British were besieging Cartagena, but they were the ones trapped. Every day cost them more men. Every night brought more attacks. Every week eroded their ability to fight. On April 20th, Vernon called another council of war. He had lost 6,000 men. Half his force was sick or wounded. The Spanish showed no signs of weakening. San Felipe was still untaken. The city was still defended. And the rainy season was beginning. Storms would make resupply from Jamaica impossible. If they stayed, they risked losing the entire expedition. Wentworth argued for immediate withdrawal. Vernon refused. Retreating without victory would destroy his reputation. He proposed one final assault, throwing everything they had at San Felipe in one coordinated attack. Army, Navy, Marines, everyone. Wentworth pointed out that the men were sick, exhausted, and demoralized. Vernon didn't care. The attack was scheduled for April 25th. It never happened. On April 24th, a hurricane struck Cartagena. Torrential rain flooded the British siege lines. Trenches collapsed. Powder supplies got soaked. Tents blew away. Men huddled in the mud, shivering, feverish, waiting for orders that never came. When the storm passed, Vernon looked at his forces and realized he didn't have an army anymore. He had a mob of dying men. On May 9th, Vernon gave the order to withdraw. The British began evacuating their siege lines under cover of darkness, abandoning cannons, supplies, equipment, anything too heavy to carry. Spanish raiding parties harassed them all the way to the boats. British soldiers fought each other for space in the longboats. Officers drew pistols to maintain order. Men drowned trying to swim to ships anchored offshore. The retreat was chaos. Lezo watched from the walls of San Felipe as the British fleet limped away. 186 ships had arrived. Now they were leaving behind wrecks, burned hulls, scuttled transports. The British invasion force had lost 9,000 men. 6,000 dead from disease. 1,800 killed in action. The rest wounded, crippled, or broken. They had fired over 60,000 cannonballs at Cartagena. They had launched multiple assaults. They had besieged the city for 67 days. And they had achieved nothing. Vernon sailed back to Jamaica in disgrace. Wentworth was recalled to London and court-martialed, though eventually acquitted. The British government suppressed all official accounts of the disaster. Newspapers were forbidden from reporting details. The medals Vernon had struck were quietly melted down, though enough survived to humiliate him forever. When Vernon returned to England, he was stripped of his command and never given another assignment. He died in 1757, bitter and forgotten. Spain celebrated. King Philip V promoted Blas de Lezo and awarded him honors. Except those honors never arrived. The viceroy, Sebastián de Eslava, took credit for the victory in his reports to Madrid, barely mentioning Lezo. Spanish court politics meant Lezo's role was minimized. He had defeated the greatest invasion force ever sent to the Americas, and his own government ignored him. Worse, the siege had destroyed Lezo's health. He had spent 67 days on the walls, coordinating the defense, barely sleeping, refusing medical treatment for infected wounds. After the British withdrew, he collapsed. Infections spread through his mutilated body. Fever consumed him. On September 7, 1741, less than 4 months after his greatest victory, Blas de Lezo died in Cartagena de Indias. He was 53 years old. No state funeral. No monument. The man who saved the Spanish Empire from its greatest threat died in obscurity. For over 200 years, Lezo remained forgotten. Spanish historians barely mentioned him. British historians pretended Cartagena never happened. It wasn't until the late 20th century that historians began rediscovering the siege and recognizing Lezo's genius. Today, there's a statue of him in Cartagena, standing on his one good leg, staring out at the harbor where he destroyed the British fleet. But for centuries, the man who orchestrated one of history's greatest defensive victories was erased. Why does this matter? Because Cartagena changed everything. If Vernon had taken the city, Britain would have controlled the Spanish Main. They could have intercepted treasure fleets, strangled Spain's economy, potentially conquered Spanish colonies up and down the coast. The balance of power in the Caribbean would have shifted permanently. Instead, Spain held on for another 80 years. The treasure fleets kept sailing. The Spanish Empire survived into the 19th century. One crippled admiral with 3,000 men delayed the collapse of an empire. And nobody remembers his name. Let's break down exactly how Lezo won, because this wasn't luck. This was tactical brilliance against impossible odds. First, geography. Lezo understood that Cartagena's fortifications turned British numerical superiority into a liability. In the confined waters of the harbor, British ships couldn't maneuver. In the narrow approaches to San Felipe, British troops couldn't deploy properly. Their 27,000 men couldn't attack all at once. They had to feed into the killing zones in small groups, where Spanish defenders could concentrate fire. Lezo turned the British advantage into a disadvantage. Second, economy of force. Lezo never wasted men. He abandoned Boca Chica when it became untenable. He scuttled his own ships to create obstacles. He rotated defenders through San Felipe to keep fresh troops on the walls. He used militia and civilians to reinforce critical points without depleting his regulars. Every soldier was used where he'd have maximum effect. The British, by contrast, threw men at fortified positions without proper reconnaissance, without adequate supplies, without coordination between army and navy. Third, psychological warfare. The night raids, the ambushes, the constant harassment wore down British morale. Vernon's soldiers weren't just fighting the Spanish. They were fighting disease, heat, hunger, and the growing realization that they were going to die in the mud outside a city they couldn't take. Lezo made sure the British never felt safe, never got rest, never had time to regroup. He kept them off balance from the first day to the last. Fourth, time. Lezo knew he didn't have to destroy the British fleet. He just had to outlast them. Every day the British stayed anchored in Cartagena, disease killed more men. Every week extended, supplies ran lower. Every assault repulsed eroded confidence. Lezo traded space for time, men for days, accepting casualties he could afford in order to impose costs the British couldn't sustain. And it worked. Fifth, leadership. While Vernon and Wentworth were screaming at each other, Lezo was coordinating every aspect of the defense personally. He knew where every cannon was positioned. He knew which officers could be trusted with independent commands. He inspired his men by example, limping through the fortress on his wooden leg, refusing to leave the walls even when Spanish artillery officers begged him to take cover. His soldiers followed him because he shared their risks. The British soldiers followed orders because they'd be shot if they didn't. Compare the two commanders. Vernon, arrogant, impatient, unwilling to adapt. He had medals struck before the battle. He assumed Spanish forces would collapse at the first sight of British power. When his initial plan failed, he blamed subordinates and doubled down on failed tactics. Lezo, pragmatic, flexible, coldly calculating. He had no illusions about Spanish strength. He planned for a long defense, prepared multiple fallback positions, and exploited every British mistake. One commander thought he'd already won. The other knew he had to earn survival. The casualty disparity tells the story. Spain lost 800 men during the siege. 200 killed in action, 600 dead from disease and wounds. Britain lost 9,000. The British suffered losses at a rate 11 times higher than the Spanish. This wasn't even close. This was a massacre disguised as a siege. Now let's talk about what Vernon got wrong from the very beginning, because his mistakes started before he even left Jamaica. First, intelligence. The British had almost no accurate information about Cartagena's defenses. They knew about the forts, the walls, the general layout. What they didn't know was the specific positioning of Spanish artillery, the depth of the harbor channels, the condition of approach roads, or the thickness of the fortress walls. Vernon assumed his overwhelming firepower would make detailed intelligence unnecessary. He was wrong. When British ships tried to navigate the inner harbor, they ran aground because nobody had properly charted the water depth. When British troops tried to scale San Felipe's walls, their ladders were too short because nobody had measured the fortifications. These weren't minor oversights. These were catastrophic intelligence failures that cost hundreds of lives. Second, logistics. Vernon's invasion force required enormous quantities of supplies. Fresh water, food, gunpowder, replacement parts for ships, medical supplies. The plan was to resupply from Jamaica, but the distance was over 500 miles. Sailing ships dependent on wind couldn't make that journey quickly. When the siege dragged on longer than expected, British forces started running out of everything. Water became so scarce that sailors were rationed to a pint per day in tropical heat. Food spoiled in the humidity. Gunpowder got damp and became unreliable. The British medical service completely collapsed under the weight of disease casualties. Ships designated as hospital vessels became floating coffins, packed with dying men and no medicine to treat them. Third, timing. Vernon attacked during the transition between dry season and rainy season, the worst possible time. He needed dry weather for land operations, but he also needed to finish the siege before the hurricane season made naval operations impossible. He got neither. The rain started in late April, turning British siege trenches into mud pits and making it impossible to move heavy artillery. Then the hurricanes arrived, scattering ships and destroying supplies. If Vernon had delayed his attack by 2 months and struck in January at the height of the dry season, he might have had better chances. Instead, he rushed into Cartagena in March and got trapped there during the worst weather of the year. Fourth, command structure. The split between Vernon and Wentworth was a disaster waiting to happen. Naval commanders and army commanders have different priorities, different tactical doctrines, different chains of command. When you force them to cooperate without clear lines of authority, you get friction. Vernon wanted aggressive action. Wentworth wanted methodical siege warfare. Vernon controlled the ships. Wentworth controlled the troops. Neither could accomplish anything without the other, and neither trusted the other's judgment. The result was paralysis. Critical decisions were delayed or never made. Opportunities were missed because Vernon and Wentworth couldn't agree on how to exploit them. Resources were wasted because each commander hoarded supplies rather than sharing with the other service. The British Army's performance was particularly dismal. These were regular troops, not militia. They should have been disciplined, well-trained, capable of conducting complex operations. Instead, they attacked fortifications without reconnaissance, without proper artillery support, without adequate medical preparation. British officers led frontal assaults across open ground into concentrated defensive fire, tactics that might have worked in European warfare but were suicidal against prepared fortifications. The fact that British troops reached the walls of San Felipe at all speaks to their courage. The fact that they died by the hundreds without achieving anything speaks to the incompetence of their commanders. Disease was the invisible killer. Yellow fever, malaria, dysentery, typhus, all thrived in the Caribbean climate. The British had no effective treatments. Doctors prescribed bleeding and purging, which weakened patients and accelerated death. Quinine, the only effective anti-malarial drug, was expensive and in short supply. Most British soldiers and sailors had never been exposed to tropical diseases. They had no immunity. When they arrived in Cartagena, they were walking targets for every pathogen in the region. Men who survived Spanish bullets died of fever. Men who survived fever died of dysentery. Men who survived dysentery died of malnutrition because they were too weak to eat. The Spanish weren't immune to disease, but they had advantages. Many of Lezo's troops were locally recruited militia who had grown up in the Caribbean and had some immunity to tropical diseases. The Spanish had established hospitals in Cartagena with actual medical supplies. Spanish supply lines were shorter, running from the interior of New Granada rather than across 500 miles of ocean. And critically, the Spanish weren't living in siege trenches. British troops camped in makeshift shelters, surrounded by latrines, contaminated water supplies, and clouds of mosquitoes. Spanish troops slept inside fortifications with proper sanitation. This mattered. Disease killed 6,000 British soldiers and sailors. It killed 600 Spanish defenders, a 10-to-1 disparity that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with living conditions. Let's talk about the night raids, because this is where Lezo showed his tactical genius. Traditional siege warfare in the 18th century was methodical. Attackers dug trenches, brought up artillery, bombarded fortifications, then assaulted the breaches. Defenders sat behind walls and shot at attackers. It was predictable. Lezo rejected predictability. Instead of waiting passively for British assaults, he sent out raiding parties every night. Small groups of Spanish soldiers, maybe 20 or 30 men, would sneak out of the fortress after dark, infiltrate British lines, kill sentries, set fires, steal supplies, and vanish before the British could respond. These raids accomplished multiple objectives. First, they disrupted British operations. Engineers trying to dig approach trenches had to work under guard, slowing progress. Supply depots had to be heavily defended, tying up troops that could have been used elsewhere. British soldiers couldn't sleep because they never knew when the next raid would hit. Second, the raids inflicted disproportionate casualties. A Spanish raiding party of 30 men might kill or wound 50 British soldiers in a single night, then escape with minimal losses. Over weeks, these raids added up to hundreds of British casualties without requiring Spanish troops to defend fixed positions. Third, the raids destroyed British morale. Soldiers who spend every night expecting to be attacked don't fight well during the day. They're exhausted, paranoid, demoralized. The British tried to stop the raids by increasing sentries and building defensive works around their camps, but this just made their situation worse. More sentries meant fewer troops available for actual assaults. Defensive works took time and labor to construct, delaying offensive operations. Lezo turned the siege inside out. The British were supposed to be attacking Cartagena, but they spent most of their time defending their own camps from Spanish counterattacks. Vernon's reliance on naval firepower was another critical mistake. Ships of the line carried massive broadside armaments, enough to reduce wooden fortifications to splinters. But Cartagena's fortifications weren't wood. They were stone and earth, materials that absorbed cannon fire without collapsing. British ships could fire all day at San Felipe and achieve almost nothing. Stone walls cracked but didn't break. Earthen ramparts absorbed cannonballs like sponges. The British fired over 60,000 cannonballs during the siege. Most of them accomplished nothing except wasting ammunition. Naval gunfire is also inaccurate. Ships roll with the waves. Gunners can't aim precisely. In theory, massed broadsides compensate for individual inaccuracy through sheer volume of fire. In practice, most shots miss. British ships anchored within range of San Felipe fired thousands of rounds and maybe hit the fortress a few hundred times. The rest of their cannonballs splashed into the harbor, buried themselves in the hillside, or flew over the fortress entirely. Meanwhile, Spanish gunners firing from stable fortifications could aim carefully and hit British ships with devastating accuracy. Red-hot shot ignited sails and wooden decks. Chain shot destroyed rigging. Solid shot punched through hulls below the waterline. The exchange of fire favored the Spanish, even though the British had vastly more guns. The scuttling of Spanish warships was a masterstroke. Lezo had 6 ships under his command, all undermanned, outgunned, and useless in a direct fight against the British fleet. So he sank them in the narrow channels leading to the inner harbor. This created impassable obstacles that forced British ships to navigate carefully or run aground. It also denied Vernon the ability to bring his heavy ships close enough to bombard the city effectively. Vernon's capital ships, the 70-gun and 80-gun monsters that formed the backbone of his fleet, couldn't get within effective range. They sat in the outer harbor, firing at maximum distance, wasting ammunition. The smaller frigates and sloops that could navigate the shallows didn't have enough firepower to matter. British amphibious operations were chaos. Landing 27,000 men on a hostile shore is incredibly complex. You need boats, organization, timing, covering fire. The British had boats, barely. They used ships' launches and longboats, small vessels that carried maybe 30 soldiers each. It took hundreds of trips to ferry the entire army ashore. During those trips, Spanish artillery and musket fire killed men in the boats. Some boats capsized in rough surf. Others got lost in the confusion and landed in the wrong places. British troops arrived on shore disorganized, scattered, out of formation, easy targets for Spanish counterattacks. If Lezo had had more men, he could have slaughtered the British landing forces on the beaches. As it was, he let them land, then forced them to fight through fortifications where his numerical disadvantage didn't matter. Let's talk about the British assault on April 9 in more detail, because this was the decisive moment of the siege. 1,500 British troops, formed in 3 columns, advanced uphill towards San Felipe at dawn. The fortress sat on top of San Lazaro Hill, 150 feet above sea level, surrounded by a dry moat 20 feet deep and walls 40 feet high. The only approach was across open ground with no cover. Spanish artillery had clear fields of fire for 400 yards in every direction. British commanders knew this was going to be bloody. They issued extra rum rations before the attack to fortify the men's courage. Officers gave speeches about duty and honor. Drummers beat the advance. The columns started moving uphill in formation, muskets shouldered, bayonets fixed. At 400 yards, Spanish 12-pounder cannons opened fire. These were the heaviest guns Lezo had, positioned specifically to cover the approaches. The first volley killed 30 men. British soldiers closed ranks and kept marching. Spanish gunners reloaded and fired again. And again. And again. Every 20 seconds, another volley ripped through the British lines. Men fell screaming. Officers shouted orders. The columns kept advancing. At 200 yards, Spanish muskets joined the cannons. Hundreds of Spanish soldiers lined the walls, firing down into the British formations. Muskets weren't accurate at 200 yards, but accuracy didn't matter when you were shooting into a mass of men. British casualties doubled. Some soldiers broke and ran. Officers drew pistols and threatened to shoot anyone who retreated. The columns closed ranks again and pushed forward. At 100 yards, Spanish defenders started rolling barrels down the hill. These weren't ordinary barrels. They were packed with gunpowder, scrap metal, nails, broken glass, anything sharp or explosive. Spanish soldiers lit fuses and pushed the barrels over the walls. They rolled downhill, picking up speed, bouncing over rocks, crashing into British formations. When they exploded, they killed everyone within 20 feet. Shrapnel sliced through uniforms and flesh. The explosions disoriented survivors. British officers screamed at their men to keep advancing. Most did. Some didn't. The British reached the dry moat at the base of the fortress walls. This should have been the moment they deployed scaling ladders and climbed the walls. Except the ladders were too short. Nobody had measured the walls properly. British troops stood in the moat, completely exposed, while Spanish defenders fired straight down at them. It was slaughter. Men tried to climb the rough stone walls with their bare hands. They got a few feet up and fell back down, or got shot, or had rocks dropped on their heads. Officers tried to organize a coherent assault. Most of those officers were killed by Spanish marksmen who had been specifically ordered to shoot anyone who looked like they were in command. After 3 hours, with 400 men dead or wounded and nothing to show for it, Wentworth ordered the retreat. British soldiers stumbled back down the hill, carrying wounded comrades, abandoning equipment, running from Spanish fire. Spanish troops didn't pursue. They didn't need to. They had won. The British assault had failed completely. San Felipe was untaken. Cartagena was still defended. And British morale shattered. Vernon blamed Wentworth. If the army had pushed harder, shown more aggression, taken more casualties, they could have carried the walls. Wentworth blamed Vernon. If the Navy had provided proper reconnaissance, measured the walls correctly, supplied adequate ladders, the assault would have succeeded. Both were wrong. The assault failed because it was badly planned, inadequately prepared, and executed against a fortification that couldn't be taken by frontal attack. San Felipe was designed to resist exactly this kind of assault. The dry moat, the height of the walls, the overlapping fields of fire, all made frontal attacks suicidal. The British should have known this. They should have bypassed San Felipe, isolated it, starved it out. Instead, they threw men at walls and expected courage to overcome stone. The second assault on April 16 was even worse. Vernon ordered a night attack, thinking darkness would protect British troops from Spanish fire. It didn't. Lezo had sentries posted throughout the tunnel network under San Felipe. These tunnels connected different parts of the fortress and allowed defenders to move unseen. When British troops started forming up for the night attack, Spanish sentries heard them and alerted the garrison. Lezo ordered massive bonfires lit on the walls. Suddenly the approaches were illuminated bright as day. British troops advancing in the darkness were perfectly silhouetted against the flames. Spanish gunners and musketeers cut them down. Effortlessly. The British never reached the walls. They retreated after losing 300 men without inflicting a single Spanish casualty. After 2 failed assaults, Wentworth refused to order any more attacks on San Felipe. He had lost 700 men in 2 battles and gained nothing. His remaining troops were sick, demoralized, and increasingly unwilling to advance into Spanish fire. Vernon was furious, but he couldn't force Wentworth to order suicidal attacks. The siege stalled. British troops sat in their trenches, dying of disease, while Spanish defenders watched from the walls. Disease accelerated in late April. The rain started, turning British camps into swamps. Mosquitoes bred in standing water. Yellow fever spread through the fleet and the army. Men developed high fevers, jaundice, black vomit. Most died within a week. British doctors had no idea how to treat yellow fever. They tried bleeding patients, which weakened them. They tried purging with mercury compounds, which poisoned them. Nothing worked. Men died by the dozens every day. Ship captains reported entire gun crews incapacitated. Army officers reported companies reduced to half strength. Vernon watched his invasion force dissolve. The hurricane on April 24 was the final blow. Tropical storms in the Caribbean are violent, sudden, and destructive. This one hit Cartagena without warning, bringing torrential rain and winds strong enough to tear tents from their moorings. British siege trenches flooded. Powder magazines got soaked. Artillery pieces bogged down in mud. Ships dragged their anchors and collided with each other in the harbor. Several transport vessels were driven onto rocks and wrecked. British soldiers huddled in whatever shelter they could find, soaked, freezing despite the tropical heat, watching their equipment wash away. When the storm passed, Vernon assessed the situation. He had started the siege with 27,000 men. Now he had maybe 12,000 effectives, and half of those were sick. He had fired over 60,000 cannonballs and achieved nothing. He had launched 2 major assaults and been repulsed both times. His army and navy commanders weren't speaking to each other. Morale was non-existent. Supplies were running low. The rainy season was beginning in earnest, which meant resupply from Jamaica would become increasingly difficult. And the Spanish showed no signs of weakening. Vernon called a final council of war on May 8. He proposed one last assault, throwing everything remaining at San Felipe in a desperate all-or-nothing attack. Wentworth refused. His men wouldn't fight. They were sick, exhausted, and traumatized. Ordering them to attack San Felipe again would trigger mass desertions or mutiny. Vernon argued that retreating without victory would destroy his reputation. Wentworth replied that staying would destroy the expedition. The argument went in circles until one of Vernon's captains pointed out that they were running out of water. If they didn't leave soon, they wouldn't have enough fresh water to make the voyage back to Jamaica. That settled it. On May 9, Vernon gave the order to evacuate. The British abandoned their siege works, their artillery, their supplies, everything they couldn't carry. They burned what they could to deny it to the Spanish. They spiked cannons by driving iron spikes into the touchholes so they couldn't be fired. They dumped gunpowder into the sea. Then they retreated to their ships under cover of darkness, harassed every step of the way by Spanish raiding parties. The evacuation was chaos. British soldiers fought each other for space in the boats. Officers threatened to shoot anyone who panicked. Men drowned trying to swim to ships anchored offshore. The wounded were left behind because there wasn't room for them. Spanish troops found them the next morning and took them prisoner. Most died of their wounds within days. The British fleet limped away from Cartagena on May 10. They left behind 54 ships, either sunk, scuttled, or too damaged to sail. They left behind 9,000 dead, buried in mass graves outside the city or dumped at sea. They left behind their pride, their confidence, and their belief in British invincibility. Vernon sailed back to Jamaica, then to England, where he faced a cold reception. The Admiralty quietly retired him. Wentworth was court-martialed but acquitted after blaming Vernon for the disaster. Neither man ever commanded again. Spain celebrated the victory, but not Blas de Lezo. The viceroy, Sebastián de Eslava, wrote reports to Madrid claiming credit for the defense. He mentioned Lezo in passing, as one of several officers who contributed. King Philip V awarded honors to Eslava. Lezo got nothing. Spanish court politics favored viceroys over naval officers. Eslava had powerful connections in Madrid. Lezo had enemies who resented his blunt honesty and lack of political skill. The man who actually won the battle was ignored by the government he had saved. Lezo's health collapsed after the siege. He had spent 67 days on the walls of San Felipe, coordinating the defense, barely sleeping, eating whatever food was available, refusing medical treatment for his infected wounds. His wooden leg had rubbed his stump raw. His crippled arm ached constantly. Shrapnel wounds from old battles that had never properly healed became infected in the tropical heat. After the British withdrew, Lezo finally allowed doctors to examine him. They found infections throughout his body, fever, malnutrition, exhaustion. They recommended rest, clean food, and medical care. Lezo ignored them. He had work to do, rebuilding defenses, repairing damaged fortifications, preparing for the next British attack. The next attack never came. Britain didn't have the resources to mount another expedition to Cartagena. The War of Jenkins' Ear dragged on for another 7 years, but it shifted to other theaters. Spain held the Caribbean. The treasure fleets kept sailing. The British dream of conquering the Spanish Main died in the mud outside San Felipe. Blas de Lezo died on September 7, 1741, 4 months after his greatest victory. He was 53 years old, crippled by decades of warfare, forgotten by his own government, remembered by the men who served under him. There was no state funeral. No monument. His body was buried in Cartagena, and over time, the location of his grave was lost. For over 2 centuries, Spain's greatest naval hero of the 18th century had no memorial. In 1952, Spanish historians rediscovered the Siege of Cartagena while researching British naval history. They found Vernon's medals, the ones showing him standing triumphantly over Cartagena. They found British documents describing the disaster. They found Spanish records buried in archives, including Lezo's reports. And they realized Spain had forgotten one of its greatest victories. In 2014, the Spanish government finally erected a statue of Blas de Lezo in Cartagena de Indias. It shows him standing on his one good leg, his crippled arm at his side, staring out at the harbor where he defeated the British. It's a small recognition, 273 years too late, but it's something. Tourists visit Cartagena today and see the fortress of San Felipe, beautifully preserved, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Most have no idea what happened there. Most don't know the name Blas de Lezo. This needs to change. The Siege of Cartagena matters because it demonstrates that leadership, tactics, and geography can overcome overwhelming numerical superiority. The British had every advantage. 9-1 numerical superiority, naval supremacy, professional troops, unlimited supplies. They should have won easily. They lost because their commanders were arrogant, their planning was inadequate, and they underestimated their opponent. Lezo had almost nothing. A skeleton garrison, crumbling fortifications, no hope of reinforcement. He won because he understood his advantages, exploited his enemy's weaknesses, and refused to give up. This is a lesson that echoes through military history. Numbers matter, but they're not everything. The Spartans at Thermopylae held a narrow pass against a Persian army 100 times their size. The defenders of Vienna stopped the Ottoman Empire at the walls of the city with outnumbered forces. The British themselves experienced this at Isandlwana, where Zulu warriors destroyed a modern army. Cartagena belongs in this pantheon of battles where the underdog won through superior tactics, leadership, and determination. If you've learned something from this story, here's what I need from you. First, share this video. Most people have never heard of Blas de Lezo or the Siege of Cartagena. Change that. Send this to friends who care about history. Post it on social media. Make sure Lezo's name gets the recognition it deserves. Second, subscribe to this channel. We're covering forgotten battles, ignored commanders, and stories that mainstream history erases. If you want more content like this, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Third, leave a comment. Tell me what other forgotten battles you want covered. Tell me if you'd heard of Cartagena before today. Engage with this community. We're building something here, a place where history gets told without filters, without politics, without sanitizing the violence and the stakes. Blas de Lezo saved the Spanish Empire. He defeated the largest amphibious invasion in history up to that point. He did it with one eye, one arm, one leg, and 3,000 men who believed in him. He died forgotten by his own government, erased by his enemies, ignored by history. That ends today. We remember. We tell his story. We make sure his name survives. That's what this channel does. That's what we're about. If you're tired of surface-level history, if you want the tactics and the truth, you're in the right place. Stick around. There's more coming. This is what happens when you refuse to quit. When the odds are impossible and everyone expects you to fail, and you fight anyway. When you turn your disadvantages into weapons and your enemy's strengths into weaknesses. When you lead from the front and share every danger with your soldiers. That's how 3,000 men defeat 27,000. That's how a crippled admiral humiliates the greatest navy in the world. That's how you win when everyone says you can't. Blas de Lezo won at Cartagena. History forgot. We're fixing that. One video at a time. One story at a time. One forgotten hero at a time. This is what we do. If you want more, you know what to do. Like, comment, subscribe. Let's make sure Blas de Lezo's name is never forgotten again.